Good afternoon, everyone. We thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's a very special day, and we want to thank you so much for joining us. One, because it's Veterans Day, and we know that our heroes and sheroes worked well to help protect this country, and we are needed now more than ever. We just came off of a election day, but we know it was really a voting day. The election will finally let us know later on. But we want to thank you for joining us because this is the final 10 Commandment series that we want you to know about. So today we're talking about clinical research, and we have Commandment 9 and 10 that we're going to cover with you. So I'll just give you a little bit in case you don't remember what those two commandments were. Number 9 said, "Thou shalt build a house of community networks and involvement among minorities that will offer ongoing education and clinical trial opportunities to their constituents that addresses the diseases that are relevant to our community." Very important. So we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do on that. And number 10, thou shalt not give up because of complacency or becoming indifferent. If the other 9 commandments do not work immediately for you or your first effort, try again. And I know your parents taught you that. You learned that in school. You learned that in church Sunday school. So try again. It is important to participate in clinical research. We have a list of expert speakers, and they're each going to tell you something about themselves, but I am going to tell you that this is a joint webinar. Dr. Kevin Sneed from the University of South Florida is co-chairing this with me. So I'm going to let him say a few words before he goes into his presentation, and then I will introduce our speakers and they will just come right after Dr. Sneed. So Dr. Sneed, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, Dr. Brown, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Your leadership in the medical community all across the country is almost unfounded, to be perfectly honest. And we want to thank you and your service here on Veterans Day as well. Also, your participation with the American Public Health Association. We're just going to take a moment and really hone in on those 2 commandments and really talk about the importance of why we must continue to foster an effort to improve clinical trial immersion from all people, from all backgrounds and all communities. As we move into a genomic age of research and clinical trials and medications, we need to make sure that all of us are represented in that. And so we're going to have a program today geared towards that, and I'm very excited to always be here with the Sanders and the 50 Hoops group. So with that, Dr. Brown, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. After you do your presentation, Dr. Hill will have her presentation. Dr. Georges Benjamin will have his presentation, followed by Dr. James Powell and Yolanda Fleming. So I will turn this program over to you. We're going to first talk about some of the great things that you are doing in an overview. We will cover COVID as an example of our clinical trials and the Project Impact program that we have at the National Medical Association as another example, how important it is to engage all minorities in clinical trials. So Dr. Sneed, your presentation.
Thank you very much. And right before I start, I just really wanted to make sure we had an opportunity to hear from Pat and Ed Sanders that have really had such an impact on not only our communities and everybody here, but all across the entire country. So Pat, do you want to give us a quick word right before I get started?
And I hate to just break in, but I know Reverend Dr. Singleton was supposed to offer us a prayer, and maybe Ed can do that for us to get us on the right track when we start this program. So back to you, Pat and Ed.
We want to first of all thank all of the participants for being involved in this wonderful program. Thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedules. It's a very, very important program. It's needed by people all around the country. This is Veterans Day, so bless us all individually, bless us as a group, bless us what we're going to do, what we're trying to do, our purpose here. Stay with us, keep your arms protection all around us. We only say thank you. We thank you. Thank you so much. Amen.
Amen.
I say what you, okay, now go ahead.
Okay.
Oh.
Go ahead, Pat.
Hang on.
Now, on this Veterans Day, as we celebrate all of our veterans, myself included, our Black men have served our country, and to all our veterans, 50 Hoops Legends want to thank you for your service. Ecclesiastes 3:14 says, I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God made it so. And so God made the work of both of these legends because their lives are dedicated to our Black and minority communities.
And one of our legends, veteran today, we recognize. Dr. Doris Brown has been a colonel in the United States Medical Corps, and we honor her service, not only to our country, but to the National Medical Association. Her love of her African-American communities across the country is unmatched. Armed not with weapons of war, Dr. Brown comes armed with her medical resources. She continues to change the world with her presence and work to outreach African-American patients about clinical trials. Dr. Kevin Sneed is also highly decorated with awards from around the world for his knowledge base, creativity, and founding of We Care. He's passionate about the African-American communities he reaches and has taken every opportunity to update his outreach with more impactful information than any other coalition to bring African-Americans into clinical trials.
As you know from their work over the past, each of our legends are powerful, active figures in their Black communities and networks. Today is our first mini conference. 50 Hoops Legends says mini conference and mini workshops because we're known for our short, powerful events. And even our mini conference will represent the quality of our work and provide resources you can take with you and study. You can read both their impressive bios in the November program at 50hoopslegends.com. So with that being said, let's wrap up the 10 commandments for recruiting African Americans into clinical trials. Dr. Brown, Dr. Sneed, it's your stage.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll tell you what, just taking a look at the order and really the people who are here. Right before I go, I'm going to ask Dr. Georges Benjamin. I know he's really active with the APHA. Dr. Benjamin, maybe we can start off with your presentation and give us an update on where we are in terms of COVID-19 across the country and the impact on the African-American and communities of color. And I'll follow right behind you, if that's okay.
Sure, Dr. Steen, I can do that. I'd be happy to do that if you like. Let me bring up my slides here, and hopefully everyone can see those.
Yes.
Great. So to set the stage, this fall, the fundamental question in our communities, is it flu or is it COVID? And with that in mind, just to remind you that we still have a global pandemic. We still have over 600,000 cases worldwide. In the United States, we have over 1,900,000 cases, over 1 million deaths. The good news, I guess, is a 7-day average is now down to about 3,500 cases in the hospital and under 400 deaths a day. But these numbers are still way too high. So the point is that while we are getting better, this pandemic is still around and still significantly impacting our nation and the world. There's just lots of variants out there. I just to point out that B4 and B5 are the most prominent ones that I highlighted in yellow. I guess the good news is that we have abundant tests. We have abundant access to vaccines. We've got a couple of really good antivirals. Paxlovid is the most commonly used one, and we absolutely want people to encourage to use those. The monoclonal antibodies that we used early in the pandemic are not as effective with the current variants that we're having. So they're used, but they're not a leading therapy. And we have breakthrough cases. We know that this vaccine, while safe and effective, lasts around 5 to 6 months or so, and then it begins to erode in its protections. It's still extraordinarily effective in making sure that you don't get really sick and die. But when you do get exposed to the disease, you can share this disease with others and get infected yourself. And there's a study that just came out yesterday that says that people with recurrent infections have a tendency to have more severe disease and a higher percentage of deaths. Because we're doing a lot of self-tests at home, that exact measure we had about how many cases we had is not real exact anymore. But we still can track the disease trajectory through a range of reportings. And I just have that list up here so you can see the many, many ways that we can track where the disease is going. So the surveillance system we have are absolutely essential, using all of these various methods to track the disease. CDC puts out these maps on a weekly basis, and you can see that this is from the end of September, but it hasn't changed much. We still have pretty good protection around the country from this disease. The CDC now recommends a new booster, which is now called a bivalent booster, which has both the original COVID strain and now the new strain that is circulating around the country. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like for almost everybody, the way we're going to simplify the discussion around vaccines now is that everybody should get a primary series. That means if you have Moderna or Norvax or Pfizer, that it is 2 shots. And if you got the original J&J, it's 1 shot, followed by this new bivalent booster shot. And you can see this pattern here. And we're encouraging everybody now, if it's been at least 2 months since you've had your last shot, to get the bivalent booster. And this is for just about everybody, except those who have real moderate or severe immunocompromise. And I define those people as people with chronic liver disease, chronic kidney disease, people with multiple underlying diseases, diabetes, heart disease, et cetera. In that case, your immune system is less effective, particularly the older people older than 70 years of age. You also should get your primary series. And you may remember early on, we were encouraging people to get 3 of those initial vaccines, and then ultimately the bivalent vaccine. So after you complete the primary series, and most Americans have about 2/3, but there's still a large number of people that have not been vaccinated at all, or who have not have completed the vaccine series. We encourage people to complete the vaccine series and get the bivalent vaccine. Why is that important? Well, this just gives you a sense of the prevalence of these complications based on COVID for underrepresented minorities compared to whites. So if you're an American Indian, Alaska Native, you're almost 1.6 times much more likely to get COVID. You're 2.5 times more likely to get hospitalized, and 2.1 times much more likely to die. If you're African American, we've done a really good job of getting people their access to vaccines. So you're much more likely to get the disease, but only a little bit. But hospitalized, over 2 times much more likely to get hospitalized, and 1.7 times likely to die. And you can see the numbers there for the Hispanic and Latino and the Asian community is certainly a lot less. But I think the important thing is that communities of color are still much more likely to get this disease, much more likely to get very sick, and much more likely to die from the disease. And currently getting the uptake of this booster shot. So we're really emphasizing the booster, and you can see that we're still lagging behind. And, you know, looking at these numbers even today, we're still lagging behind with African Americans not up to date in getting the booster shot. That really remains a real problem, and we have to do better on that. So part of this webinar series is to encourage people to actually go out and get vaccinated. Just to point out that the flu is also raging in our community. We always track what's happening in the Southern Hemisphere. This is a map of what's happening in Australia. You can see that in Australia, the red graph here is what happened in Australia in their flu season, which was a few months ago. You can see that it occurred earlier and it was much higher. That's exactly what we're seeing here in our country. Influenza is attacking people at a much higher rate, and it occurred much earlier. So it is important to get your flu shot. So we know that the flu surge has already started. We know that how bad a COVID surge will depend on whether or not the strain changes, vaccination levels, whether or not we're wearing masks or not. Right now, we probably going to have to take this bivalent vaccine on an annual basis. So I think we ought to just get prepared for that. We are seeing the influenza surge, as I mentioned. The good news is that we have vaccines, reliable diagnostic tests for both influenza and for COVID. And with that, I'll stop and be available for the Q&A at the end. Back to you, Steve.
Yes, and I just wanted to say that, Dr. Benjamin, if you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself. I know that your bio is on the website, but just give us a few words about your background. And I'll
Sure.
ask each of the other speakers to do the same. We put in the chat the link to the overall program on the website where you can see all of these great experts that we have here.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brown. Actually, Dr. Brown and I both served in the Army Medical Corps. I'm an internist and an emergency physician. So on this Veterans Day, I just want to salute my friends and colleagues who've served our nation with great distinction. And I served both as the health commissioner for the District of Columbia for a couple years and Secretary of Health in Maryland for a few years. And now I'm the executive director at the American Public Health Association.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your service as well. Okay, back to you, Dr. Sneed.
Yes, thank you very much. You know, Dr. Georgia, that I know we're all doing volunteer work today, but I almost feel like I paid you some money to queue up portions of my presentation. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the backdrop of COVID-19 and the pandemic to really talk about some of the work that we did here with We Care, really how important it was to get out there and get into the community, get messaging going. But number one, well, first of all, making sure that people understood why it was so important. And number two, why it was so important for communities of color. And so I'm going to share my screen here. And so I'm going to ask you all to buckle up and hold on tight so we can stay on time. And of course, you know, Dr. Brown mentioned commandment number 10, thou shalt not give up, become complacent or become indifferent. If the other 9 commandments don't immediately work or in your first trial efforts. So as I mentioned before, as I talk about just COVID-19, just as a backdrop for why clinical research is so important in our community, is I do want to disclose that I was a clinical investigator with the company Novavax for their COVID-19 vaccine. Now I'm going to start off, I'm the executive director of a program called We Care, which stands for the Work Group Enhancing Community Advocacy and Research Engagement. I'm going to show you all a very 1-minute video that kind of talks about the background and the importance of our community efforts, along with one of our community partners, Reach Up Incorporated. So, well, why do we care? Why we care? Why this program? We want to improve health outcomes.
The collaboration between USF Health's Tanasia College of Pharmacy's We Care program and Reach Up Incorporated aims to bridge the gap between underserved communities and access to care. We Care's mission is to increase the representation of diverse populations in clinical research. It starts with rebuilding trust between academic and clinical institutions through educating and empowering the community, and then providing research opportunities along with protection and advocacy for the participants.
They want to hear the story from folks who have been through a clinical trial.
You have to share all of that information with everybody.
So take the opportunity to have a better quality of life in our communities. Join us.
And so as we went out into the community, we had one really important core value, that we were going to tell the community the truth. We need to make sure that they heard the truth so that they can make a very informed choice about what they were going to do and whether or not they were going to get vaccinated or even participate in some of the clinical trial research that we had forthcoming and then ongoing after that. Now, when we went out there, there were some challenges that we had to overcome, and I kind of broke it down into 3 areas of how, what, and why. The number one thing, we had to make sure people knew that, yes, the COVID-19 virus is real. There was still misinformation as to whether or not it was real and how dangerous it was. Number 2, how could you protect yourself? We wanted people to wear a mask, and we wanted them to get that vaccine, and we wanted them to social distance. And then number 3, why? Well, I'm going to show you why here over the next couple of slides. So the only reason I put this in right now, this is something I showed to the community. Often I would tell them, out in the community, no matter your background, no matter your education, I'm going to pull you into my scientific background, into my scientific world. And so I would use the spike proteins and the mutations that people were hearing about to kind of educate them about the virus and why it was so dangerous and how it was going to affect their bodies should they become infected with it. The other thing that we really had to help a lot of people understand is that it wasn't just a respiratory virus. Many people thought, because you're looking at TV, and every night when they showed people that were coughing and they showed people that were in the hospital on a ventilator, we often heard about the pneumonia. But the other part that we didn't hear about, and you see on the image on the far right, was that almost every internal organ in your body could be susceptible to being affected, okay, AFFECT, affected, if it came into contact with the virus circulating through your body. What was not known to many people is that many people, especially during the Delta variant, died of multi-organ failure. It was not simply pneumonia that was killing many people. And also what we had to let people know is that if you had chronic conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure, which I'll show you in just a moment, that these were conditions that will make you far more susceptible to being affected by the virus that causes COVID-19. Now, the next thing I did was go through and make sure people understood that, from a population standpoint, why we needed as many people as possible to either get into clinical trials, number 1, and or get vaccinated after they were approved through emergency use authorization. And so I would show the community this particular slide, and I would say, listen, right here in the state of Florida, African Americans make up about 17% of the population, and those with Hispanic or Latino background make up about 26% of the population. I would next go through, and at the time that we were allowed to collect this data, our Department of Health in the state of Florida, they stopped at one point collecting racial data when it came to the vaccines. But again, I would actively show people the number of people across the state that were getting vaccinated, both on a statewide basis, and then what was happening right here in Hillsborough County. And then I would go one step further and I would show them this particular information and make them understand that so for example, here in Hillsborough County, if we make up 18% of the population, we should be much higher than 6, 7, or 8, 9% of the people who have been vaccinated. And so as we began to communicate this information to the community, what we saw was a very marked uptick in the number of people that were vaccinated, all the way to the point that at one point in time, before it became available to everybody, right here in Hillsborough County, across the state of Florida, we had the second highest number of African Americans that had been vaccinated, and we had the second lowest death rate among African Americans across the entire state of Florida. And many people really attributed much of that effort, not totally, but much of it, to the effort of the We Care team. Now, early on in the pandemic, I began taking a look, and I said, and I do a lot of cardiovascular work. It's really my background. And I said, I was hearing all across the country that African Americans were really the ones that were primarily initially being affected the most when it came to the COVID-19 virus. And then once I understood that we were talking about a cardiovascular driven virus and not simply a respiratory virus, I took these two graphs and I put it into a publication, an online publication, and I showed people, I said, we can predict where people are probably going to have the highest death rate simply based on where the density of people were that had diabetes and cardiovascular complications. That led to me writing, a couple of open articles, and you all can find them online. But in the very first paper, and you can see I wrote this back, published it back in April of 2020, very close at the very beginning of the pandemic. I identified at the very beginning, there is a growing question of the health equity, in some cases inequity, of supplied medical resources in those areas with a high prevalence of racial and ethnic citizens. And so we knew from the very beginning who was more likely to be affected and how we needed to enhance and increase our efforts in many of these communities across the country. And so I put this in just to kind of show, again, you see this was published in National Geographic in April 24 of 2020, again, fairly early in the pandemic. One of the things that I didn't have time to show here is that one of my mentors, Dr. Keith Ferdinand, was actually quoted in this particular article, but it didn't matter which state you looked at, that we found that African Americans were disproportionately affected from COVID-19. And knowing this, and remember, at this time, we had no vaccines. At this time, we had barely begun even thinking about the clinical trial pattern, but we knew who was going to be the most affected moving forward. And as you heard Dr. George had mentioned before, I put this information in. Now, this is information, I pulled this slide, you can see in the lower right corner. I got this information on November 7th of 2020. And up to that point, we had 223,000 people who had died of COVID-19. And 1 out of 5, 20% of those were African American, which far outpaces the 13% of African Americans in the country. So yes, African Americans were being disproportionately affected. We knew they were being disproportionately affected, and we actually had the data to support that. And we took this data and went directly to the community at all times to help them understand how important it was for them to engage. Now, here's information that's more recent, and myself and my We Care team, and right after me, you're going to hear from one of our very esteemed 50 Hoops legends, Dr. Angela Hill. But we're still out in the community right now. When it came down to COVID-19, we found that over the past 2-year period, COVID-19 became the 3rd leading cause of death for people across the entire country. Now, that's pretty amazing given the number of people that still remain affected through heart disease and cancer. That's COVID-19 over a 2-year period raised up in front of everything else you see on there to become the 3rd leading cause of death. And then more importantly, and again, we just showed this data last month, that the life expectancy because of COVID-19 was dropping. So if there were ever a reason to get engaged, if there was ever a reason to go out and get vaccinated, if there was a reason for African Americans and people of color in general to get engaged in many of the forthcoming clinical trials, I'm just going to put a little PSA in right now. There are going to be widespread clinical trials for even a nasal form of the vaccine coming up very shortly. They have already started doing this. If there were ever a reason, we're looking at it right now. Life expectancy should never drop. And then more importantly, when you take a look at life expectancy, I didn't put the slide in for time's sake, but when you take a look at life expectancy for African Americans, we were already at the lowest end, and we dropped even further by about an average of 3 years per individual, which is an astronomically high number. So some of the other information that we went out into the community early on in the pandemic, here you see a slide, people were saying, well, it hasn't been tested. It's never been tested. And I said, no, that's not true at all. And we would show them what you're looking at here. And you can see in the red boxes, I put them in bright red, the FDA briefing documents from both Pfizer and on the next slide by Moderna, that was showing that, yes, indeed, if you see that yellow line there, 10% of all the people in these clinical trials were African-American, and 26% of people in all the clinical trials were Hispanic or Latino. And so when people were saying it hasn't been tested, we were saying, no, it's actually been tested in 40,000 people. In this case, when I go to the next slide, with Moderna, they had 27,000 people. Again, you found 10%. Now, remember, historically, we were finding less than 2 or 3% of people of African Americans in any clinical trial getting involved. So this was very heartwarming for me to see that there was an increased engagement, not as much as we might want, but certainly threefold more than we had been having before with any other clinical trials. So, but the evidence of telling the public and telling our communities that, yes, it has been tested and it was tested in people that look just like us, encouraged many of them to not only get vaccinated, but eventually to get involved in some of the ongoing clinical trials that we had. Now I'm going to take a shift here and begin talking about We Care, the importance of community immersion, and why we cannot give up at this particular moment. Now, what you're looking at here was one of the earliest studies I ever did. It's called the N-Shape study, but it informed me of why I needed to get more immersed and more engaged in health equities research. Here, I went out to various churches and I asked a simple question: do you have diabetes, yes or no? And what I found was really astounding. Yep, I got you. What we found was the fact that many people actually had that said, no, I don't have diabetes, actually had diabetes. And so that really helped us understand that, that in terms of getting engaged in clinical research, African Americans still perceive far greater harm when it comes to that. Also, let me just kind of move forward here, that we needed to make sure that we immersed with people to gain their trust. And so the program We Care, we emerged from a health equity center that became We Care, you see there on the right. And I put Reach Up Incorporated here in the green box because Reach Up Incorporated became the single most important nonprofit community-based organization that allowed We Care to get into the community and begin to supply all this information. And then finally, as I turn it over to Dr. Hill, we employed all the principles of community-based participatory research that have been evidence-based, that we found that communities of color can actually can accept and gain their trust to be involved in. I put this slide, is really interesting that we have APHA. Many of you recall Dr. Adewale Troutman, former president for the APHA, American Public Health Association. He just died about 2 months ago, but he was on our original research advisory board. We're showing a picture of him, and Christina Mathis, who also died of COVID, by the way. And then finally here, as I turn it over to Dr. Hill, we're bringing technology into the communities at a level that we just had not ever seen before to make sure we bridge that community divide. So I tried to do that as quickly as I could, Dr. Brown, and I'm going to turn this over. And Dr. Hill is now going to share exactly what We Care is and what it has done for our communities here in the Tampa Bay area and across Florida and the country now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sneed, and good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides now. Dr. Sneed has already given a wonderful introduction to what We Care does. And I have to say the last 11 years, he has made the work that I'm doing as project director for We Care one of the pride points and most fulfilling parts of my career. And so as he shared with you some of the work that we've done, again, our overall objective is kind of two-sided. As we try to close the gap in health disparities, we also are giving attention and sharing the mission of 50 Hoops in terms of closing the gap as it relates to diversity in clinical trial participation. So we continue to do that work. But one of the things that we have identified, particularly since the start of the pandemic, is that we kind of narrowed down our focus to continue our work with cancer disparities, but we've expanded it and connected it to key diseases where having any of the chronic disorders kind of increases the likelihood of complications and other disorders. So you see a list here of some of our health equity initiatives that we focused on, but we've never left out some of the contributors like obesity, smoking, binge drinking, infant mortality, of course, dementia and cancer. And to tell you a little bit about myself, I've spent 2/3 of my career as a practitioner working in the world of dementia care and mental health. And so I feel that I'm aligned with the We Care mission. And I have so many family members, unfortunately, who've been diagnosed and or died from cancer. And so this is true and near to my heart. But I actually met Mr. and Mrs. Sanders back during my days at FAMU. And since then, our relationship has grown and they have become as an essential key partner for the We Care work that we do. And Dr. Seed has already talked about some of our other partners. So this year, they are hearing about it. We are launching an initiative where we are going to really engage all of the initiatives that our key partners are putting forth, starting with tobacco, because we know that tobacco has been the source of a lot of our chronic disorders and problems. And if you look at just ethnicity use of tobacco, you see that African Americans, unfortunately, are second to, our American Indians and Alaskans and other groups that culturally embrace tobacco use a little differently. But it is unfortunately causing a multitude of health risks, which you can see visualized in this particular slide. Not to mention smoking, but alcoholism is another issue that we don't talk so much about these days, but we know contributes to a lot of the poor outcomes. So what we're doing is starting a wellness club recruitment, and today you too can join. So it will be the We Care Wellness Club. It's a free membership, and you get a chance to benefit from a year-long of wellness initiatives where we'll be focusing on all things to manage health from a better perspective. We will have things dealing with physical health, mental health, spiritual health, as well as financial health. So if you get emails from any of our partners or us inviting you to join, please not only sign up yourself, but sign up others. And what that will actually afford you is an opportunity for us just to remind you of those things you know about, like needed cancer screenings and other health prevention activities. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that we have up and coming so that when you get the emails, you won't be a little surprised. But what we also plan to do outside of having reminders about the healthcare initiatives and prevention issues is we're going to have focus groups so we can get feedback from the community in the spirit of community-based participatory research on what the needs are. So these are some of the things that we're doing. We're launching a 23 and 23 challenge in hopes of trying to get at least over 2,023 individuals enrolled in our wellness club by the end of 2023. Say that real fast, right? And we're going to partner with all of our key community partners and try to identify an initiative that they're already doing so that we can actually help make them more effective and include them in our wellness initiative. We're actually doing a vaccination event December 3rd. I'm trying to, again, get people to get boosted as well as the flu vaccine. Last night was the first of a 4-part series where we're merging the pharmacy and faith community in hopes of trying to knock out the stigma associated with mental health. And so we invite you to that. And then in 2023 in April, we'll be working alongside the Alzheimer's Association to host one of 3 statewide community research forums. So you'll be getting notification about that. And as you join our wellness club, you'll also get a reminder and some other little trinkets in terms of important health screenings, depending on your age. Again, we'll be sharing with you on a month-to-month basis things that, again, remind you of the things that you need to be asking your doctors about. And we hope that this can hopefully curb the impact of chronic diseases. And as pharmacists, certainly we'll be doing our part to make sure that if there's any issues related to medication use or adherence, that we address that as well. So in closing, we'd like for you to join us, join our wellness club, and certainly party with us. And we'll be sharing this information. We Care will continue to try to fulfill its mission by helping the community understand more about the importance of clinical research, about healthcare disparities, and certainly support the research community as well, so that we can help them in terms of designing culturally tailored research initiatives. So this is my contact information. And again, I wish you all a blessed holiday season, but please join us in terms of our wellness initiative. And thank you so much. I turn the mic back over to Dr. Brown, and happy Veterans Day, Dr. Brown, Mr. Sanders, and Dr. Benjamin. I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. And thank you again for participating in this. We have now a couple of poll questions that we'd like to run so our participants can actively get engaged with us. If we can have a couple of those questions. And while those questions are coming up, and we'll give you an opportunity to click on the answers there so that we can see that. We know that there's a significant amount of scientific evidence that's been mounting and pointing to physiological distinction as well as some genetic distinctions between gender, races, et cetera. And it's really important for us to look at the diverse enrollment of participants in those clinical trials. And so you're going to hear a little bit more about that diversity and why it's so important, because morbidity and mortality is still higher for people of African descent than others. And so we need to get greater evidence if we're going to stem the disease. And let me just ask, we can't get the questions up? Okay, we won't have the questions, maybe they'll come at the end, but what we're going to do is move on. And we know, as I said, despite, oh, there it is. How about this? Let's see, is it important for us to have our community included? Oh, great. I am so thankful that you've been listening and you see that it's important. Yay, we're doing a good job so far. How about another question before we move to our next presenter? Okay, we had great results from that one, okay? Is there another question? Okay. And while this question is coming up, perhaps Dr. Powell will tell us a little bit about himself. He is going to be our next speaker.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this program. Now, let me see. Okay, here we go. Okay. Let's see. Can you see me okay? See the
Yes, we can.
I don't think I have the right version up, but all right, well, let me just go ahead. Yeah, thank you very much. And to tell you a little bit about myself while I work on this, my background is I'm a physician and I trained in clinical pharmacology. And I spent a number of years in the pharmaceutical industry. And in that capacity, I did very early on create a clinical trials diversity team within the industry in the company that I worked with. And at that time, I was responsible for clinical testing from the initial introduction into humans all the way through to phase 2, phase 3, and at some point transitioning products from prescription drugs to over the counter. Now, I really appreciate this opportunity to share. I was asked to share the story, our story with Project Impact and what we did. And I hope you see the right slide because I can't really tell from my system. But I am going to talk a bit, and Yolanda Fleming is going to be working with me. She worked with me on the project. And we're going to share the story of how we got what we did and how we got to where we are with respect to our efforts to pursue clinical trial diversity. Now, let's see. One of the things that happened as a part of my efforts to in the industry, I was asked to work with the National Medical Association in the process of working on a consensus panel. And we had a number of people, some from industry, academia, we had consumers, physicians, and one of the things that the conclusion of the consensus panel report was that inadequate representation of African Americans in biomedical and clinical research has a negative impact on the quality of medical care and is a significant contributor to health disparities. We had ideas and we knew that African Americans weren't participating and that there was some level of trust with respect to clinical trials, but we didn't have a lot of data on actual participation. But over time, actually, what we did see and what we learned is that, of about 1 billion visits to a physician every year, nearly two thirds of those visits involve the use and prescription of a medication. And the unfortunate thing about it is that when we did begin to see the data and FDA began to share information with respect to actual participation in clinical trials, as many as 80% of the drugs that were approved annually had didn't have enough data from diverse populations to prove their safety and effectiveness in non-white patients. And I have one particular example here. This was a drug that was approved in 2015. You see, it was approved for heart failure. Now we know that heart failure occurs quite frequently in African Americans and other people of color. But as you see from this graphic, over 88% of the people in the clinical trial that led to the approval of that drug were white, and 1.2% African Americans. Now the question is that sufficient data to be able to tell you how to use that medication safely and effectively in African Americans? Do we know whether they respond differently? Do we know whether or not the effectiveness as well as the adverse events are the same in African Americans? Those are questions, but we had no answers. And that's the problem when we have drugs approved without the data and a diverse population. And we know that we depend more on global trials, and many of those trials will include patients from outside of America whose habits and practices, disease, concomitant disease, and other factors show that they're quite different from the American population. So we began what was called Project Impact. Now, Yolanda and I got together and we looked at as much as we could about all the problems and what we could do. And I got to give Yolanda credit, even though we tossed it back and forth and argued quite a bit. She came up with the name Impact, which is increased minority participation and awareness of clinical trials. And we settled on our mission as to improve the validity of clinical trials data, supporting therapeutic interventions in people of color. This is what we wanted to try to accomplish. And how do we want to do that? Well, first thing we had to do, we had to educate patients on clinical research, what they are, what the benefits and protections are in the process. And Yolanda is going to talk about that in a few minutes. We also wanted to educate physicians on clinical research as well. Just because you went to medical school don't necessarily mean you know what clinical research is all about and how it's done and why it's important, especially with respect to clinical drug trials. And then we embarked on a program of how we would train the minority physicians to be a part of the research process. So I'm going to talk a bit about our focus on physicians. And one of the things we said at the very beginning is that every physician can't be an investigator, but every physician can learn enough and know enough about clinical research to be a resource to the patients who trust them. Some physicians are not in the environment, or if they're seeing 50 or 60 patients a day, adding the responsibility of doing clinical research is just too much of a burden. But that doesn't mean you can't learn enough to know that and to guide your patients on when and where it might be appropriate for them to participate in the clinical trials process. Especially if you're the one that they look to for information and you're the one that they trust. So what we began is a process of going across the country and talking to physicians about clinical research, and that included some dinner meetings, half-day discussions on Saturday mornings when we could catch them and talk to them about research. And that was quite a successful program that had the involvement of not only us who were putting on the program, but we had the opportunity to bring others in as speakers, some from industry, some from what's known as institutional review boards, the people that reviewed clinical trials, and people that understood the regulations and ethics and have them to participate in that process. In addition to this, we created what we call the Show Me the Data campaign. And what that was about is a lot of physicians in their daily practice will see people from the different companies that come to you and try to get you to prescribe their medications. That's been a part of the process for many, many years. What we, in our program, and every time we had the opportunity to talk to physicians, we told them that what you should ask every time they ask you to prescribe a medication is to show me the data. Show me the data that this says this product has been proven safe and effective for the patients that I treat. Now, a lot of people say, well, you know, talking to detail people, they don't have any real power within the industry. But I can tell you this really worked out, because once you start saying that enough to the people that are trying to sell you a product, they take it back to their companies. Their companies then say, okay, we have to get the data to respond to the needs of the people that are prescribing our products. And I know it worked because it worked in my company when they didn't know I was part of this program, but they came to ask me, how are we going to get this data in the aftermath? And people keep asking about it, but I didn't tell them we were behind the product, but that's another story. But what we did in terms also was to try to raise the awareness of physicians about what we're really talking about. I showed you the one slide of Kolanor that was approved in 2015, but the FDA since about 2014 has been publishing what's called Drug Trial Snapshot. And I should tell you that we were part of advocating since 2000 that the FDA disclosed the information on demographics of drug approval applications for products that made it to the marketplace. And finally, after several years of talking, the FDA actually did it, and it was published. They began publishing in 2014. It's published every year, and it gives the demographics of the population, and it gives you the information on the history, the experience with that product in the patient, in the clinical trials population, the demographics. And so that's how we know, as I said, nearly 80% of drugs are approved without adequate information in African Americans. Now, in order to address this, of course, one of the main things we wanted to do was train physicians, those physicians who had the interest and the capability to be investigators. And that is part of the training. We thought we examined a number of different programs that other people were sponsoring, but we chose to create our own because we didn't feel it met the needs of our population. And that meant that we wanted to train people on how to make the decision of whether they can be an investigator, whether they're going to be a serious. If you're not prepared to do it correctly, then don't get involved in all, because the responsibilities are too great. We have to train them on what the good clinical practices requirements are. Good clinical practice doesn't mean you just do, you practice well. It means there's a set of regulations that tell you how to do clinical research in a manner that the government, meet the government requirements as well as ethical requirements. We talked about engaging the patient in the discussion of clinical research. Don't avoid the issues of good, like the guinea pig that always comes up, or the Tuskegee experiment that generally comes up when you talk about it. But we train them on addressing those conversations, responding to them, and perhaps even being the ones to bring up those issues so that you make sure that the people understand the protections associated with the process. And then, of course, developing the cultural competence, the ability to relate to the population and address the issues that may be important to that individual with respect to their thoughts about clinical research. In addition, if you're going to be a part of clinical research, understanding the business of clinical research and being an investigator, so that if you decide to make an investment, you can be successful as an investigator in completing the tasks that are required by the clinical trial. So that's more of the focus on physician. I'm going to ask Yolanda to chime in here and talk a bit more about the advocacy efforts. And let's see, I think Yolanda is there with Dr. Brown.
She stepped out, so I would ask you to continue.
Okay, oh, that's interesting. Okay, she's going to talk about and focus more on the consumers, but I'm going to tell you a couple of things, part of the advocacy that particularly related to things that we'd worked on doing, and that is, we saw a number of protocols that were being written, not to say we want to exclude African Americans or people of color, but the way in which they were designed sometimes would exclude parts of the population that has certain manifestations of the disease. For instance, a design of a trial that says we want to study people with lupus, but we want to study people with lupus that don't have renal involvement. But if you know anything about lupus, you know that African Americans are overrepresented with respect to renal involvement in the lupus disease. And so, in essence, what you've just done is written a protocol that in some manner excludes African American patients. So one of the things that we did with respect to advocating is we went to FDA and talked to them about the design of their trials and making sure they look for those issues where you are designing out parts of the diverse community. And that they look for that in the protocols that were submitted to them from industry. Another way that I should tell you that when we began this process and we began to talk to FDA and told them that we really needed to talk to them and they had to address the needs. And this was back in 2000. And they sent us a 2-foot stack of documents. They're saying, okay, this is what, these are things that relate to our clinical trials process. So you want to give us feedback on that 2-foot stack. And we actually did call in a few people that were related and that we knew. And we were able to share with them every place, several places within the regulations that they could change in order to meet the needs of our diverse community. And in fact, one of the things we did very early is have that conversation with FDA, and they were able, we had a conversation with them and told them the changes that we would need to make and told them that we thought there would need to be more done and that they had not necessarily done what was necessary to protect the African-American population. And they, in fact, agreed with us. And so that began our continued, since 2000, our continued work and with the agencies to begin to address those issues, the issues. One of those being the drug snapshot that I shared with you. As I said, we advocated for that in 2000. We finally saw it happen. I'm not saying we're the only ones that were involved in advocating, we were very much involved in the effort to get the FDA to disclose the demographics of the population to support drug approvals. Another thing, and in fact, since 2000, we've had discussions with every commissioner at FDA to discuss what is being done and what progress is being made. Now, the other places where we advocated in that respect with the agency is that we talked about having representation at every level of the process. And that meant that we engaged them on identifying candidates to be at the FDA advisory committees who are reviewing this information and drug approval process. And in fact, we've had people who sat around the table after the products have gone through the clinical trials process and gotten to the FDA and gotten to the advisory committee and had the opportunity to slow down, hold the program until they got sufficient data in the straight and positive our community. And that was a big step. And what we've continued to say is that we need to have we need to have people in the IRB, people at the FDA, people that are investigators in clinical trials, and we've indeed have submitted names for commissioner over the period of time since we've interacted with them. Some of the other things, business case, we've talked to different companies about why it is important for them to do have diversity in their clinical trials. I think that was early on. I think since as a result of the COVID experience, there's been much more understanding and interest with respect to the diversity of the populations and the need to have a better understanding of the patients who are actually burdened by disease and have them involved in the clinical trials process. Now, Doris has.
Thank you. Thank you,
I'm gonna
Dr. Powell.
shift to Yolanda and let her talk.
Well, Yolanda has not returned, so we're going to open it up for our Q&A. If we can, okay, let's see.
Let me close this.
Okay, if we can come back to open this up for our question and answers. We know, and some of the important factors that's there, and I'll start off with a couple of questions just to get things started. And I think the first question that, James, I will ask to you is in terms of Project Impact, and we've moved to a newer version. Can you speak to, there was a new FDA guideline that just appeared earlier this year, I believe. Can you speak to that FDA guideline? Because we know, and you've talked about the 2 million physician visits and 2/3 of them getting prescriptions. And we have no idea, to a large extent, the impact that those drugs have in terms of metabolism, et cetera, on those African Americans. And we know those that have gone to clinical trials and are now post-marketing data being collected. What does this mean when we don't know? And I'm sure my audience, there's a significant number that never thought about asking their doctor, how many people participated in a clinical trial to get this drug to market? We don't ask those questions. We have just become afraid when we talk about COVID and the vaccine, and we know that most of those studies have 10% or more of African Americans participating in those vaccines that made it to market. So the FDA came up with some new guidelines. Can you and Dr. Benjamin speak about those guidelines?
Oh, absolutely.
And I hope you didn't, the screen didn't freeze on me.
I'm
but it
here.
looks like Dr. Powell is in a
Can you see me?
freezing mode there. Can you hear me, James?
I can hear you. I can hear you. You can't hear
Hello?
me?
Maybe we're all frozen. I think the screen.
No, we're not
frozen. I'm
frozen.
going
We-
to-
Everything,
We're okay.
everything's recording.
Okay, you're back.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, Dr.
can
Powell,
hear
yeah,
you,
go right
yes.
ahead, because I'm going to chime in right behind the two of you.
Okay. Well, if you can hear me, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the guidelines because I'm glad you brought that up. The FDA has put.
Michael, can you hear him? I can't hear him.
We can hear him.
Okay,
Yes,
good.
We can hear. We can hear him.
Okay, all right, well, let me go ahead then. Yeah, FDA put out guidance, and the guidance is requiring sponsors to submit a plan for how they're going to engage a diverse population in the clinical trials as a part of their drug application evaluation process, and include the patient experience in the application. And in fact, they have identified several specific points that they want to make sure that are included in that plan, and that the outreach to that community reflects the epidemiology of the disease. And then that's a major step forward. And in fact, if you over the years, we talked about advocacy, and I know the Yolanda's are going to talk about it a little bit more, but over the years, we've responded to a number of documents the FDA has put out. And one of the things we also included was this specific point, that every new drug that's being developed should have a plan as to how you're going to outreach to the patient population, and what should be the level of representation in that plan, from the phase 1 clinical trials, phase 2, as well as all the clinical trials that are done to support that project. So now the FDA has finally encouraged it. But let me tell you a little bit more, and that what's on the tap is also the DPICT Act. That's currently before Congress. Now, it's been passed by the House, it's waiting to go to the Senate. And it also talks about the need for a clinical trials plan and for diversity, but it makes it law. The FDA can encourage it, but the legislation is the one that can require it. FDA in its guidance can suggest it, but it requires an act of legislation to require it, and that's where we are right now. We have a draft guidance from the FDA that says you need to have a plan. We have people that are working against that guidance, but the actual law is before Congress to evaluate that would require sponsors to have that. Dr.
Okay. And someone, Lori Abrams, I believe, put in the chat, and thank you for that statement, that yes, the FDA has come up with guidelines, but the action will meet the road when it is implemented. We look at what's happening in the community and patients, et cetera. So it's time will tell. But I think we've made the first step, and that's very good. And we want to go on to see what's going to happen down the line. But it is imperative that we engage, make sure that you are asking your physician if a clinical trial is available based upon your disease category, and if you can participate, and help them to find that study if they don't know about it. So I wanted to go and ask a question for Dr. Benjamin. I know we talked about the bivalent vaccine that is now, everybody should have it. I mean, it's been 2 months since you had your other vaccine, but we didn't really speak about the children. And I know it's flu season, and we're seeing RSV, and the kids are, more of them going to hospitals than before. And so what can we say about where we are in terms of getting the bivalent vaccine down for the 6 years and younger group?
Yeah,
While I read another question.
good point, Dr. Brown. So far, they've approved the bivalent vaccine for children and adolescents. So that's age 5 or 8, depending on which vaccine you're taking. But they have not yet for the younger children. So there is still work to be done on that. I anticipate us getting that done over the winter. For RSV, there is not yet a vaccine for RSV, although there are some really great studies that show that protecting pregnant women protect young babies under the age of 6 months. And we're seeing RSV in the very, very young, principally, and then and very old, also adults as well. I think most people expect to have an RSV vaccine, hopefully in the next year, at least, probably an EUA, emergency use authorization, maybe in the next 12 months, it'll be available. That's hopeful thinking, but we think that might be the case. but the big killer right now continues to be flu, right? Influenza
Yes.
still is a big one, and it's absolutely available for children and adolescents, and of course all adults. And so this is indeed a bad flu season. I think the way to think about this is the fact that for the last 2.5 years, we have been sequestered from one another. We've been washing our hands diligently and we're wearing masks. And for a disease process, respiratory diseases, that's how you catch them. You catch them from other people through a respiratory route. So now that we're back out amongst one another with episodic mask wearing, we're much more likely to be exposed. And one of the things about our immune systems, which is kind of interesting, is that our immune systems love to be challenged. So every year when we get challenged by, all of these various viruses and other infectious diseases, it revs up your immune system. And so if you spend 2 years kind of with your immune system relatively being dormant, unless you got exposed to COVID, your immune system is kind of asleep. And so what happens now when you get exposed to influenza, even though you may have seen influenza last year and the year before that and the year before that, it does take your body a little bit of time to rev up. And so getting that vaccine is very, very important for reminding your immune system and activating your immune memory. So we absolutely expect everybody to get vaccinated. And, people don't like to get their shots, but it's absolutely essential you can do that. And again, just to remind you, you can get your COVID shot and your influenza shot at the same time. In fact, I got one in my left arm and one in my right arm.
Yes.
Dr.
Okay,
Brown.
thank you so much. Yes.
Dr. Brown, I
Dr.
just wanted to go back in 30 seconds or less, go back to a point that was made by Dr. Powell. I'm just coming from the American Heart Association scientific sessions up in Chicago. And I also serve on the Association for Black Cardiologists Board of Directors. And I can affirm with you the number of pharmaceutical companies that we were meeting with that are seeking diversification of their clinical trials right now. And so, as I was leaving the meeting, I did call for the fact that we need to get as many of our disjointed organizations together right now, probably convene. I'm talking, of course, NMA, ABC, We Care, NPHA, get them all together because there's a grand opportunity. And I think Laura Abrams really mentioned, she said, time will tell. Well, I think in this interim moment, we need to all come together and really formulate a plan, because not one organization can cover everything for everybody on the 48 contiguous states. But we can form a plan and a guidance plan, toolkits, and other means to foster clinical research among the entire continental. So I left very encouraged, but I realized that had we not been doing work like Project Impact for the past several years at We Care, we would not be in a position right now to probably capitalize on the FDA encouragement for diversification in clinical trials.
Yes, and I want to say also, it is important for us to volunteer. When you see those public comment periods out there,
Yes.
they're asking for our input. And
Yes.
we need to be diligent about putting that input in. They're now asking for participants to serve on those advisory boards. Sign up, go through your organization or sign up as an individual. So now let me ask Dr. Hill a question in reference to We Care and the number of components that's there. Your membership program, that sounds fantastic and exciting. How is it limited to people that are in the state of Florida? Can people sign up wherever they are? Is there an age restriction? How do we become more engaged? It's a fantastic thing that I think will make us healthier in terms of our community, because we know many of the chronic diseases that we have has a lifestyle component, and that's putting us at greater risk. If we can alter those negative lifestyles, we can then maybe get away from some of those diseases. So speak a little bit more about your wellness program.
Yes, all it takes is an email. We actually are reaching across the diaspora even with our efforts. And I had a meeting last week with Panama, the country of Panama, and meeting later this month with the UK. So no, We Care is going global. So you all need to talk to Dr. Sneed. I'm going to need more help to kind of get this going. But no, we really would like to put a challenge out to all organizations to join us in this effort. And I think that we all can make a meaningful difference. All it takes is an email. So I'll put my email in the chat right now. We are already starting a database so that once we start putting out things, we'll have information circulated via social media as well as by direct email. And we're asking that our key partners will also help market as well as communicate and recruit people to our wellness club. So no limitations. All you have to be is human at this point or a
If
supernatural.
I might add one thing to go to each of the legends. You've got that database and all of their networks. Just
Yes.
don't leave your sisters and brothers out of this.
I will not and do not have plans of doing that. So please don't forget to tell Dr. Sneed I need more help.
Yes. I think if there's a question from our audience, you can put it in the chat, or perhaps we can bring you on. Let's see, I'm looking at the chat. Have I missed any? Have not missed any questions. There was one statement to say that our polls were taken down so quickly, they could not see them. So if we'll put the polls back up again, they'll give you an opportunity to look once again. But I want to say we have a very attentive audience that are listening carefully and answering the questions correctly, and we appreciate that. But we want to make sure that if we haven't answered any questions for you, to please put that question out there.
On the polls, there were 100% answered all of the polls. So everybody answered the polls.
Thank you so much. Okay, Pat and Ed, I'm going to turn this back over to you. I see our time is drawing nigh. I don't know if Reverend Singleton is on. And while I look for questions.
You got Spiders of Preacher's Kid, so he's got this.
Okay, okay.
Oh, and don't forget the gift card, Doris. Just pick someone out of the attendees.
Okay,
and,
let me go back to my list here and find a name. Okay, stop sharing. Close. Okay, full list. How about Lawson Pilgrim?
Okay.
Perfect.
I think you need to put your email address in the chat, Lawson Pilgrim. You have gotten one of our gift cards.
We have him. He's part of the 50 Hoops basketball guys that started right in the Little Rock, Arkansas, the big dogs.
Okay.
Thanks, Lawson.
Yes, well, thank him so much for attending. Great. Okay, so I'm going to turn it now back over to Ed.
We want to thank you, first of all, dear Lord, for allowing us to put on this wonderful event. Thank you for all the people who participated, all those who wanted to but were not able to for some reason or another. It was a wonderful program, a lot of good information. We appreciate the time, the effort put in by everyone. Thanks again, thanks again. Thank you, dear God, for allowing this to happen.
Yes.
Bless all of each one of us, one by one. Take us home safely. For this we say thank you, and we love you. Let us all say amen.
Amen. Thank you all for attending, and happy Veterans Day to the veterans.
Happy Veterans Day to all of you.
Thank you so much for all
Doris.
of our
Thank you,
experts
Kevin.
that were here. Hopefully, and it looks like from our polls, people were listening and learning, and that's what we're all about. So thank you very much.
God bless all of you. Have a good weekend.
Okay. There was a question, Angela, about physical activity. Is that included in the We Care program.
Yes, there are some aspects of it. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay.
So I'm gonna ask
Well, Dr.
them.
Brown, we pulled that one off on
Yes.
Veterans Day, just like
Great
you
job.
said we would.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And
Wonderful.
I know you're busy at your event, so that makes it even more special.
Yes, and of course, we will certainly get together. As I said, you know, we'll be down in Florida for the Cobb's